Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of Black Writers Read. We have made it to the end of season 4. This is episode 18, the final live stream of the season. My name is Nicole Young Martin, and I'm the founder, producer, and host for this series. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started with today's conversation, especially given that this is the last episode of the season. First off, last episode, I mentioned that Black Writers Read was going to be doing a collaborative event with Grub Street's Boston Writers of Color in June for Juneteenth. That event has actually been moved to September due to some scheduling conflicts and things like that. And I also want to make sure that I put together a really tight panel. It's going to be on connecting place in both your writing and also too in like writing convenings. I have a really um great list of invitees out, so I'm really excited to plan that event. Also, be sure to subscribe to the audio podcast, which is available on all platforms, as there's going to be some special things released exclusively there this summer, including I'm doing a special little episode of on Juneteenth, and then next there'll be something in July. So please be sure to subscribe to the audio podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, all the places where you get your podcasts. I am there. Lastly, I'm in the process of planning season 5, which will run from September 2024 through June 2025. I'll be announcing more details over the summer. I so far have some amazing people lined up for next season. So let's go ahead and get today's conversation started. Black Writers Read showcases, celebrates, and honors the words, work, and traditions of Black writers from across the country, across genres, across experiences, and across the African diaspora. Black Writers Read is a behind the scenes conversation into the craft and what it means to create as a Black author in today's society. Since starting the series during the summer of 2020, we've hosted almost 70 authors representing 10 plus genres from 4 countries and 16 states. Our virtual platform includes the live stream interviews and audio podcasts, book clubs, and curriculum development assistance, as I am an educator. Find us online at blackwritersread.com. Today, we welcome back Lisa Braxton, who participated in our Black History Month live stream event back in 2021. We had Angie Chapman on earlier this season, who was also on that particular event. Lisa Braxton is the author of the award-winning Dancing Between the Raindrops, A Daughter's Reflections on Love and Loss, published in April of 2024. The memoir and essays is a powerful meditation on grief, a deeply personal mosaic of a daughter's remembrances of beautiful, challenging, and heartbreaking moments of life with her family. It speaks to anyone who has lost a loved one and is trying to navigate the world without them while coming to terms with complicated emotions. She is the author of the novel The Talking Drum, winner of a 2021 Independent Publisher Book Awards Gold Medal, overall winner of Shelf Unbound Book Review Magazine's 2020 Independently Published Book Award, winner of a 2020 Outstanding Literary Award from the National Association of Black Journalists, and a finalist for the International Book Awards. I actually got to get, because I have it on Kindle, I actually have to get a paper copy of it so I can get all the little stickers on it, because it's gorgeous. She is an Emmy-nominated former television journalist and a writing instructor at Grub Street, Boston. She actually did a workshop there this morning. She is the president of the Greater Boston section of the National Council of Negro Women and a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Today's conversation will feature Lisa's newest book, Dancing Between the Raindrops, A Daughter's Reflections on Love and Loss. And this is a little bit more of a description of the book. So, a little bit of background. Lisa's parents died within 2 years of each other, her mother from ovarian cancer, her father from prostate cancer. While caring for her mother, she was stunned to find out that she herself had a life-threatening illness, breast cancer. In this intimate lyrical memoir and essays, Lisa takes us on the core of her loss and extends a lifeline of comfort to anyone who needs to be reminded that in their grief, they are not alone. To learn more about Lisa and her work, please visit lisabraxton.com. That is LisaBraxton.com. So I like to put this out there before we start the conversation. Memoir. We've talked about memoir a lot this season because memoir is one of my favorite genres in terms of how it's creative nonfiction, where there's space for the author to explore memory creatively. Lisa is extremely vulnerable in this book. There's so much that she explores and uncovers, and I really, really appreciate that. So there are some questions in here that are a little bit more personal than typically when we talk about memoir. So I'm really excited to dig deeper into the conversation. So, for those of you who are new to Black Writers Read, here's the format of our show. Lisa will read an excerpt from her work, and then we'll chat. If time remains at the end of the conversation, we'll open it up to Q&A with those who are joining us today. We have viewers joining us from Facebook and YouTube. If you have a question, please feel free to include it in the comment section on the platform where you're joining us from today. I will compile the questions and either pose them to our guests following our conversation or insert them during an appropriate time within our chat. I'd now like to bring Lisa back on to the virtual stage.
Hello,
Hi.
Nicole. Hi.
Yes, welcome back. It's so great to have you on.
Great to be here.
Yes, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Have fun reading.
Okay. I will read one of the chapters in my memoir and essays. And this chapter is called Squirrel. People spend good money to rid their homes of squirrels. They'll place an emergency call to their local rodent removal company and pay whatever it takes to come out on the winning end of a rodent invasion. But in our case, Dad not only welcomed a squirrel into our home, he vowed to cook it. Ours was a tree squirrel, the kind that lives in woodlands, forests, and backyards, gracefully scampering and leaping from branch to branch like a trapeze artist, squeaking, making nests, and climbing trees backwards and forwards. But that life was long overdue for our squirrel. Remember when we used to catch these and cook them? My Uncle Norvell, Dad's brother, said, his voice bouncing off our kitchen walls. He handed Dad the chilled squirrel parts encased in white plastic, as if it was a prized trophy. The package took the shape of a large sausage. Sure do, Dad said, in a typical cool, composed, measured manner. Yet his eyes twinkled as he cradled the package in his palms. Uncle Norvell had brought the squirrel with him on one of his rare trips from Virginia to Connecticut, to our home in Connecticut. I don't know if he took a train or drove, but he managed to keep the rodent cold for the duration of the journey. Dad found space for the squirrel in the freezer, poured a couple of Scotch and club sodas, and he and Uncle Norvell spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about their childhoods in Lowesville, a small farming village west of Charlottesville. Up until that day, I heard nothing of Dad's adventures squirrel hunting with his brothers, but I was not surprised. Dad, the youngest of 13, had often entertained my sister and me on long car trips with details of his many adventures growing up. Dad's family lived close to a creek. Grasping spear-like metal instruments called gigs, he said he and his brothers would wade into the water and jab frogs with them. Then they'd fry the frogs and make a meal of them. From the back seat of whatever sporty car Mom and Dad had at the time, Sylvia, my sister, and I would pull ourselves up to the edge of our seats as Dad described the hunting and capturing process. What does a frog taste like, Daddy? We'd ask. Is it nasty? Not at all, he'd say in his casual manner. It tastes just like chicken. Dad told us one of his chores before going to school each morning was milking the neighbors' cows. He hated it. His hands would get so sore and tired from squeezing the cows' tits that he came up with an ingenious way to make the job easier. He added water to the milk buckets so it would appear that he had done all the milking. This seemed fine until one day the neighbor lady said, "Peck," my father's childhood nickname, "the milk don't taste right. I can't figure out what's wrong with it." My father simply shrugged and feigned ignorance. Mom said she felt sorry for the cow. Dad played the guitar when he was growing up, strumming tunes while his brothers gambled at card games. He said, unbeknownst to his brothers, coins would fall between the floor's wooden planks in the old building where they played. He said one of the benefits of being a small kid was that he could crawl under the building and at the end of the night collect the loose change for himself. "You are going to cook it, right?" Uncle Norvell said to Dad. "Sure am," Dad responded. But as the weeks turned into months, the squirrel became a long-term resident of our freezer, front and center, surrounded by Swanson TV dinners, meatloaf-sized portions of ground beef wrapped in aluminum foil, and A&P brand chicken drumsticks. I rarely opened the door freezer of our early 1970s combo refrigerator freezer during my preteen years. Mom did nearly all the thawing and cooking at the time. But on the off chance that I had a hankering for a popsicle in the months after Uncle Norvell's visit, I learned to divert my eyes. The plastic encasing the squirrel hugged the contours of his little body and left me repulsed. I don't think that Mom was fond of having wild game in the freezer either. Are you going to cook that thing? Mom would blast the question at Dad every few weeks, with emphasis on the words, that thing. I'd hear Dad respond, but I was never close enough in proximity to make out what he was saying. From his tone of voice, he didn't sound as enthusiastic as he had during Uncle Norvell's visit. Eventually, the squirrel ended up in the back of the freezer, the edges of its plastic casing the only thing visible. And one day I opened the freezer door and the squirrel was gone. As distasteful as it was, at least to Mom and me, Uncle Norvell's gift was thoughtful. It opened the door for brothers to bond for an evening to look back on their carefree childhood days. I don't think that Dad ever had the intention of cooking Uncle Norvell's gift. His enthusiasm in the moment may have been fed by both graciousness or a desire to not have his brother think that he'd forgotten his roots, or maybe both. Like many nostalgic gifts, the squirrel had its place briefly in the present and permanently in the past where it was destined to stay. That's my reading.
Thank you so much for reading that section of the book. Yeah, because I have Southern roots as well. And so I'm like, I know about the squirrel in the back of the fridge.
So you know about the squirrels.
Yes.
Have you eaten some yourself?
No, no. 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 I'm like, I'm a proud granddaughter of the Great Migration, but there's certain foods I have yet to try.
Uh-huh. Well, you know, there is a recipe in my book for squirrel stew in case you want to get adventurous.
Here's the thing though, where would I get the squirrel from?
You weren't listening when I said there are tree squirrels who swing from tree to tree and they go up and down the trunk. They're right out
See,
there
I'm
in your
not that.
backyard.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm not that adventurous. That's the thing. I'm like, I just want to go to Stop and Shop and just be like, can I get a squirrel?
That's the
Like,
first step. You get your I don't know what you would get. Your what are those things up those little and you shoot at it and you knock it out of the tree and then go from there.
yeah. And we have a ton. We have a ton of squirrels in our backyard.
Mm.
Yes. So yeah, the first question I have for you, and I so appreciate your book so much. I like to start us off by asking the question: what is the origin story of your memoir, Dancing Between the Raindrops? I would love to know the story behind the title and why this book right now, especially given how recent your parents both passed.
I call myself an accidental memoirist. I had no intention of writing a memoir, but in 2018, when my mother passed out after Thanksgiving dinner, we were all in the basement of the house after the extended family. We all came together for dinner, and we were in the basement playing cards, and the guys were watching football. Mom fell out, and she passed out and was rushed to the hospital. And initially, the doctor said, well, it seems like she's dehydrated because she's not drinking enough water with her medication. But things went downhill from there. And she was eventually diagnosed with ovarian cancer, went through treatment. My father at the time had dementia and Parkinson's that was not diagnosed, but he was on a cane and wobbling and being irrational from time to time. I was diagnosed with breast cancer and I lost my job, not because of COVID, but because the company decided to downsize our department. So I was let go with a lot of other people. My husband lost his job. And I have always found writing cathartic. And I began writing essays. Looking back, my parents were on the downhill slide. They were both in their 80s. And I was writing and reminiscing about when I was a child, just fun things that happened, and oh, yeah, Uncle Norvell visiting with the squirrel, all kinds of stories. And I also was buying I was buying some memoirs, some grief memoirs, ordering them through Amazon and reading those, and they were helpful too. They were comforting as well. I did go to some grief cat classes, grief support groups online during COVID and in person afterwards. But what really was comforting was reading other people's stories to know that I was not alone. And I thought, with all the writing I've been doing, maybe I could do a collection. And I contacted maybe 8 or 9 small presses, and Seed Crow Press, who published me, she responded right away. And she said, I see you've got about 70 pages here, and we would need about 100 to bind the book. I like what you're saying here. If you can just keep working on this, and we set a deadline of 4 months. And I said, okay, I'll work on this. If I can produce 100 pages, then they'll publish my book. They sent me a contract. So that put fire under my butt to get this done. And I continued to think about what happened with mom and dad and wrote stories, had my sister read everything before it went to press because I wanted to make sure that everyone's grieving story is different, but she was there too. So she said everything seemed accurate to her, and she liked my stories. It was touching. She helped me with the proofreading as well, and that's what happened. I feel that Dancing Between the Raindrops is finding the joy in the midst of the sorrow. If you can't find the joy in the midst of the sorrow, it'll just eat you up. So in the story in my book, one of the first, I think the first story is about the pajama party for 2.
Mhm.
Mom was at the end. The doctors said after all the chemo, the cancer has returned and it is more aggressive than it was initially. There's nothing more we can do. And my sister was actually on that call, like a Zoom call with the doctor and my mother. And my sister said, well, what do we do now? And the doctor says, enjoy yourself, make new memories. If you want to eat ice cream, go ahead and enjoy it, make new memories. And I feel that, and I did that with, I held a pajama party for 2, mom and me, on her hospital bed in the bedroom because she did home hospice. And we had a great time taking selfies and pictures and getting into our pajamas. So that was an example of dancing between the raindrops. We knew, mom only had a few more days or weeks to go. We found a fun way to spend that evening. So that's where that title comes. And I was working with, after I had everything written and I was sending it out, I was working with a publicist who said, do you want to try to go with a large publisher or get something out right now? And I said, let's get it out now because the country is suffering. We suffered through George Floyd. We suffered through, Trayvon Martin. We suffered through the pandemic. We suffered through people dying in the pandemic. And we've been suffering so much, and self-care is so important. And so many people have lost loved ones. I think the time is now. And that's why I went with the press I did, and a small press, a women's press. And that's the story behind Dancing Between the Raindrops.
Nice. Yeah, because I think that's one of the reasons why I appreciate your book so much is because how much I can relate to your story. Because both of my parents, they died within a year and a half of each other, I think. Mom first, dad second, very suddenly. They were younger. They were in their 50s and early 60s. And it's like my grief journey has kind of been very similar. It felt like I was alone because though I had other friends who lost a parent, I didn't have a friend who lost both parents and both parents so suddenly, tragically, in a short period of time. And so when you reached out to me about being on Black Writers Read, I was like, yes. So there was like a part of me selfishly that wanted you on so that I could
Mm-hmm.
talk with you about the book because of just when I read about it, how much I was able to relate to your story. So
And it's funny,
yeah.
I was at a book club meeting. I'm in a book club, and um, this month I said, why don't you read my book? And they did. And one of my book club friends, the story Revolver about the gun on my
Yeah.
parents' property that we were just trying frantically to find because, dad has dementia and he was doing this demonstration to mom. When somebody breaks into the house, here's what you do. And it was like, we've got to find this gun. And this friend of the book club, she was talking about how her father, I think he did have dementia with her father. He would have at the table. He's watching TV, and on the TV tray, he had a gun next to him. And she and her sister were just so nervous about that, but they knew they couldn't get it away from him because he would blow up and say, leave me alone or whatever. And he was a friendly person, had kids in the neighborhood who play in his backyard. He's sitting there
Wow.
watching TV with a gun, but nothing ever happened, thank goodness. So it's so funny how so many things that were in the book, friends and others who've read the book have said, that happened to me. I can relate. It's so relatable.
Yeah. Dancing Between Raindrops. This is one of my favorite. This was one of my favorite questions to compile. Dancing Between Raindrops includes poetry, photographs. Like there's the one of you and your mom on the bed at the slumber party. I love that picture. A crossword puzzle and prose, all illustrating the journeys you and your family took when it came to both your parents' illnesses, your own health journey, and also times during your formative years. I really appreciate your vulnerability and how you walk the reader through these various moments, so much so that we could use Dancing Between the Raindrops as a guidebook to help us when and if we have to take on similar challenges. Can you share a little bit about your writing process and why you included a mix of poetry, photographs, and prose in the book?
I know the topic of grieving can really bring you down. I mean, it's a weighty, heavy, serious topic.
Mhm.
And I wanted to be able to express the grieving and take the reader on the journey without them walking away from the book and just wanting to lie down, and take a nap for a couple of days. So
Yeah.
I think, like, telling my story about the crossword puzzle, which was the intervention with Dad. And Dad, you cannot open another store without your business license expired years ago. You can't just open another business. And he's not listening. He's blowing up at us. And so I told that story that way using a crossword puzzle. So the reader has some breaks in there,
Yeah.
breaks where, okay, what's the next clue? What's the next clue? And so you get the idea of what happened without it just really weighting you down. I also use my broadcast background to do a TV news script about a time when Dad would wander off. And oftentimes people who have Alzheimer's do wander off. And he would wander off. My mother is like, where's he going? And he would walk all over the city with his Parkinson's on his cane to go to variety stores and buy lottery tickets and spend up all this money. She would call the police, give the police his picture. And so I did a news story about, and this stranger, found him crossing the highway, the highway ramp, and that you used to get onto the highway. And he said, "I'll take you home." And my father said, "No, I will not get into your car." So this man walked my father all the way back. And my mother opens the door, and this strange man is standing there with my father. And the man said, I don't want any payment. Don't worry about who I am. I just want to make sure he got home okay. And I captured that in a TV news script, which
Mhm.
is, that's this way, it's not just the heaviness and the anxiety ridden story about, oh, geez, you're going to get home okay. It's the TV news anchors give a buffer. So it's more of a somewhat clinical presentation of the story. And that's why I use the different forms. And people have said that some parts they laughed at, they cried at, but to be able to have humor in there along with the maudlin, the morose parts, I thought was important.
And I also too, and it was so heartbreaking. And this leads into the next question: the press release about the clothing store closing and the reason why it closed. That broke my heart, but at the same time, given where you grew up and many, places similar, like I know a lot of this happened in Detroit, gentrification kind of played a very interesting role in that.
Yes, one interesting thing was that when my parents when they found out that the store was going to be taken, the store, the other properties be taken for redevelopment, the people in the city, the people who had supported my dad and mother over the years, they rallied around them, and they said that to the city, you need to give them payment for this. You can't just take their property. So that was good. They got a nice check for their properties. And then I think that the mayor, I don't like this at all, but the mayor of the city got into the steam shovel, and he was actually at the controls to like destroy the actual brick and mortar, and that's captured in the Connecticut Post newspaper. So I feel like in a way he was somewhat gleeful. Let's get rid of this property and let's move on. It was tough for my parents, but especially my father, because we didn't know that he had dementia. So once the store closed, he stayed in bed for a couple of days. He was depressed, and then he starts this idea of opening another store at the age of 85, 87. And he brings home all the stuff, the inventory, the sewing machine, the mannequins, and he hires these people. My mother didn't know who these people were, to build a building in the backyard to store these things. And then one day my mother gets up and she's going into the living room, or she's going to the kitchen. There's a strange man standing in the living room, and my father's sizing him for a suit. Later, my father is in the driveway with the sewing machine and an extension cord making alterations. And one of my dear friends, who's a medical doctor, said to me, "It sounds like he has dementia." And it wasn't until many years later that we got him diagnosed, but that's when we saw the signs. He couldn't pivot. He couldn't pivot because that's all he knew, and he had dementia. So that was a real turning point, a revelation, when the store was shut down. They're now building a grocery store there, I understand. And I spent so much of my childhood there that I was in Bridgeport for an event for a previous book, my novel last year. And one of the people who runs that bookstore said, "Oh, well, they're building, this grocery store. Why don't you go over, drive over and see how it looks?" And I said, "I can't. I can't do it," because the store was so much a part of my life, and there were so many memories there.
Wow. So the next question that I have for you, and I, thought this was so interesting, and and again, this is another reason why I related to the book so much, because my parents told stories. They grew up in Detroit around the time of the race riots. My parents were like 10. And I remember they told me the stories about how racism displaced a lot of people. And this is something that comes up in your book. Racism plays a significant role in the book, so much so it felt like a character. It felt like a
Mm.
character to me, where it was like the character of systemic injustice was coming in. And so I just really, I really appreciate how that was illustrated in the book. So can you talk about why it shows up so prominently and how it contributes to the narrative? And then, if you could share with us who is your ideal reader for the book, given that so much of that time period in the 60s and 70s, which were your very formative years, how it shows up in the book.
Can you please give me the first question again?
Yeah, sorry, my questions are so long. So can
Why
you
you saying
talk
why
about?
did racism play so much of why was that so much of a thread through my book?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know that it was, and I think the reason I didn't know it was because it's been a part of our lives. It's something that was a part of our existence. And it wasn't like I noticed it and said, let me put it in this book. It was just something incidentally that happened in the book because it was what happened in our lives. My parents, as I mentioned, they grew up during Jim Crow in the South and lots of discrimination. We always went home, though. We always went back to Virginia for homecoming every summer, homecoming at my father's church. And on the way down on I-95, the closer we would get to Virginia, the more their stories would come out. They would start talking about what they went through, going to the back of the bus, having change thrown at them, having to go to the back door of a restaurant. They couldn't go in and be served. My mom babysat a little Caucasian child, and she had to, if they went to the theater, the movies, they had to go to the balcony. That was the black section. And this little white child's looking around like, oh my goodness, what's going on here? So that happened every single time. It was like it was oozing out of their pores as we got into DC and into Virginia, all these stories. And my sister and I would be in the back seat, and I would hear the same stories over and over, but different parts of it would come out each time we were traveling. And I think part of that was it was part of their healing process, or just they needed to get this out and they wanted us to know about that because the world could be cruel and I think they wanted to protect us. And then when they were house hunting, one time we were in somewhere in Fairfield County. I think it was Fairfield. I was maybe 9, 8, something like that. My sister was a lot younger, maybe 3 or 2. And we look at this house. It was a nice house. We walk outside to go back to our car, and you look down the street this way and that way. It was a white neighborhood. Every person, every house, somebody was standing at the front by the road, their pathway, looking at us. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Until, because I was a child, I get in the car and I could hear my father say to my mother, they don't want us here. And so we didn't get that house. And my parents stayed in the same house until they passed away. Well, my mother passed away in the bedroom. My dad in assisted living. They never moved. The neighborhood changed. All my friends in the neighborhood, my white friends in the neighborhood, they left. They went out into the suburbs. I would come home from college and, and they're all gone and they never left. And that was a part of the reason I think that they didn't move on. And you had another question for me. What was that question?
Yeah. So given especially how you illustrate your parents' experience in the South, and then a lot of the experiences in your formative years in terms of like systemic injustice, who besides folks who are grieving, because I feel like there's another audience out there too, who else is your ideal reader for the book, given how history kind of shows up?
Oh, I think that the ideal readers are people who are in the younger generation who may not know these stories because my parents are gone. That generation is passing away. That generation that lived through, Jim Crow. My father served in the military in the segregated unit. Those people are passing on. That's a rich part of our history. And I think that students need to read this, younger people. I also think that beyond anyone who's grieving a loss, anyone who enjoys family stories, anyone who is of an older generation who wants to look at the good old days, because I have a playlist of songs that my father enjoyed. He would have his quiet time in the basement and play his Marvin Gaye and play Nat King Cole and others. And I have a playlist and Sam Cooke. Those songs are there listed in the book. So I think my ideal audience is anyone actually, anyone of any demographic, because I think it can appeal to people who just want to read a nice, heartwarming stories, or people who want to read about racial injustice or any of those other topics other areas I mentioned. So I'm hoping that I think it can appeal to just about anyone.
Mhm. So this book is memoir, and your first book was fiction. What are some advantages of exploring grief through memoir? And then what are some challenges that can come up when you're exploring such a story using memoir?
Let me see, challenges when you're writing a memoir. I think that memoir is very popular these days. So, from a publishing standpoint, it might be hard to be heard because lots of people are writing memoir. Back maybe 10, 15 years ago, it seemed like memoir was done mostly by your movie stars, your famous people. But nowadays, you see memoir all over the place. So I think it might be hard to get your story to bubble up to the top to be interesting to a publisher. And somebody said to me when I think I was at a writer's retreat in Arkansas, it was a few years ago, and someone there said they were told, don't write a breast cancer memoir. Everyone is writing breast cancer memoirs. They're just a dime a dozen. And I knew that writing a memoir itself, when I was in grad school to learn how to write a novel, the professor said, if you memoir is hard to get published. It really is hard to get published. So I felt, for one, I'm not going to try to get a large publisher, a big, well-known publisher to be interested, and I'll write a certain type of memoir. So mine's a grieving memoir. So that's a little bit different. And being African American, I don't know how many African American memoirs about grieving there are, and I try to find a niche. That can be a challenge. Another challenge can be I had to, from time to time, put things down because just literally put it down because it's draining and exhausting. And I mentioned earlier that I had my sister proofread it. I was a professional proofreader earlier in one of my careers, and I did, I was proofreading it myself too, but I was like, I can't do this anymore. I have to lie down. I'm reliving all of those things that we went through with my parents. I can't relive it anymore. I need to give this to someone else. I gave it to my sister and had her read it. That's also a disadvantage. Advantages are that, as I said, memoir, it cuts both ways. Memoir is popular these days. And the good thing is you don't have to, memoir is typically about, it's a snapshot in your life. It's not it's not your autobiography. But because you're doing this story about this one segment of your life and it's popular, it's a good time to write a memoir because they are popular and people are reading them.
Writing about grief and memory can be, as you mentioned, emotionally taxing. How did you care for yourself while you were writing Dancing Between the Raindrops?
Well, I think I cared for myself the way I always do. I would, I'm working full time and writing, but also I'm going to the gym and I'm taking, these Forever Fit classes where you're taking a ball, you're bouncing it in the air, you're bouncing it. I even bought a little green ball and I'll go out in the where we live and just bounce it around. Aqua Zumba, Aqua Fitness. You jump in the pool like you're a kid. Like I think about whenever I go to Aqua Fitness, Aqua Zumba, I think about when I was a child and my parents took me to the Red Cross classes. I never learned to swim. I could not float, but I'm back in that moment. I can jump around in the water. They can't see my legs, and I'm not doing what the teacher is telling you to do. I'm doing what I want. I'm jogging, and I can have a great time. So just getting away from it and being silly and having a sense of humor. And we have, my husband and I have a corgi, a Pembroke Welsh corgi, who does figure into the book. And you probably may have read about Regina, right? I think you read about, if you read the book, you read
I
about
did.
Regina.
And I saw, was the dog with your father in the picture?
Yes, yes. And the
Aww.
story is called The Comforter in Chief because
Yep.
she is, and she was the Comforter in Chief. And she's funny. I mean, I put little sunglasses on her the other day, and I took photos with her. So I have fun with the dog. I'll chase her around the house with a broom, and she's running. It just what works for me. What worked for me for writing this was just being a kid all over again, and just being carefree and silly, and finding ways to vent.
Nice. Yeah, because speaking of dogs, we have three, and they typically make a premiere during Black
Mm-hmm.
Writers Read, barking or coming up. They're really quiet right now, and I'm
Oh
like, let's
well,
see if
don't say any more about it because then they'll start barking.
I
Mhm.
your first book, which I totally didn't compute that you wrote these two books within a short period of time. So that's huge because writing a book on itself is like phenomenal. So to do two within a couple of years
No,
is huge.
I wrote the book. The first one I wrote, and it took me 10 years to get it published. So,
Oh,
and then this one it took me what 6 months. So it seems close, but no, it took me 10 years to get the Talking Drum published.
wow. I didn't realize that. Okay.
I had a
Um,
lot to learn, I guess, about the craft of writing a novel.
oh, so this question will
I
be
revised that book for 10 years. I revised it for over 10 years. I
wow.
was
So
saying,
this question, oh no, I'm sorry. Go
I
ahead,
was saying
Lisa.
to myself, gee, I hope I don't die before the book comes out. I was
Oh
like, do I live
no.
long enough to see the book? So I was determined to get it done. I was like, I might die before this comes out, but I didn't. But it was so long. I was thinking that.
Yeah. I didn't realize that. And actually, speaking of that, I watched, I can't remember who it was with, but it was like, I think like a community television station that you did an interview with. I remember there was like a little drum on the table, and
Oh
you
yeah,
mentioned in that interview that your parents were still alive when that book was published. So I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, which is awesome.
yes.
So I'm glad that they,
That was a lovely moment because the book came out. The Talking Drum, my novel came out, and I told my mother when I was about 5 or 6, I want to be a novelist when I grow up. And I was determined not only to live long enough to see the book published, but to also, have mom and dad see the book published. And some Mother's Day, a few weeks after the book came out, it was COVID shut down, and mom was in the midst of chemo treatments. And we didn't know back then. We didn't know how it was transmitted. If you could, breathe on somebody and they get it. So my husband and I drove down to Bridgeport from Boston, and I wouldn't come into the house. My mother, came to the door with my aunt, who was a caregiver, and I opened up my book to the page, the dedication page. It said for my parents, and I put it up against the glass door, so Mom could see it, and she was so proud of me. And my father, he was coming down the stairs to the front door because he knew I was there on his cane, and he's wobbling. I'm like, oh, please, please don't fall over. But he had the biggest smile on his face. He was so proud. They were both so proud of me, and that just meant the world to me that I lived long enough to see it published and to hold a copy of the book. When we put my father in memory care, on one time on Zoom, we were talking to him, and he said, I read 36 pages." So he read to page
Wow.
36. He probably had an aide read to him, but the fact that that meant something to him, and I made sure I had a copy of the book in his room, in his suite, on display. And so they were both so proud of me, and that meant so much for them to see that published. And I know they would be so proud of this book as well.
Nice, it's so sweet. I love that you had that moment with your parents. So your
Yes,
first book, The Talking Drum, which was published in 2020, and Dancing Between the Raindrops share several themes, including belonging, history, systemic injustices, and building community. Now, given that I hear that it took you 10 years to do The Talking Drum, I think this question is going to really be a master class response. How would you say as your writing evolved between the two books?
I'm not sure if I could answer the way I would like to answer it. Well, part of this was that I was writing essays, I was writing short pieces to deal with my grieving. And so I compiled them. It was a compilation of some things I'd written throughout the time that my parents were sick, a few pieces I'd written a few years back, and then some that I wrote once I got the contract. So these are very short chunks, short pieces. With the novel, it's this is more like Dancing Between the Raindrops is not, as you can see, it's not chronological. It's not like it's a beginning, middle, and end. It's various stories that may go in circular motion, the circular way. It's not like I'm telling the story from the beginning up until they passed away. It loops around, and you get an entire picture throughout it. With the Talking Drum was much more challenging because you have that the narrative. You have to deal with your imagination. You've got to create the characters. Each one has to have their own personality that's maintained throughout. There has to be the conflict and the conflict over the conflict. In the Talking Drum, the conflict, the major one was the urban renewal that was coming to town. And then you had the conflict between the African Americans and the people from the Caribbean and Africa and their neighborhood. That's the neighborhood that was being taken over. And then you had the conflict with the newlywed couple and their marriage. And then you had the conflict between the husband of that newlywed couple and his best friend who lived across the street, who thought that his friend who wanted to open a bookstore had sold out. Then you have a
Hmm.
conflict with the guy across the street and his girlfriend who had suffered abuse from a previous relationship and who had a child who was acting out. And then
Hmm.
you've got to make a story out of making a story out of all that makes sense. And all those characters are doing their world in the larger world. At the end of it, you have to figure out a resolution that the reader is satisfied with. So
Hmm.
that might give an idea why it took me 10 years. It was a lot more complicated, a lot more
Hmm.
complicated.
Yeah. So we got a question in from one of our viewers, Opal, who joins us a lot. We're really good friends, and she's been on Black Writers Read in the past. The question that she asked, and Opal, buy the book because it's beautiful, and this will expand on your question. But what role, if at all, do religion and spirituality play for you, your narrator, while writing the story? The going back to the memoir.
What role did religion play for me?
Yeah, religion and spirituality, if at all.
That they were a big part of the real situation because we had the pastor of my parents' church came by and he actually sang to Mom while she was on her deathbed. She was still coherent and she was conscious at the time, he came by, and we also I had to discuss with him the before mom passed away, the funeral, the plans, and run of show basically. And I was venting to him on the phone once. He would call every so often. How are you doing? Venting to him about dad's acting crazy. He's buying all these lottery tickets. He's spending all this money. So that played a big role, and also the deacons from the church. When my mother was first hospitalized, the deacons and male and female deacons, they were at the hospital with us. They prayed with them. They had the Bible with them. And I kept saying to myself, when I retire, I think I'd like to become a deacon. I want to do this kind of work. But they were there every step of the way. After my mother passed away, I went to the church, and this is the church I grew up in. So my parents joined the church when I was in my high chair. I grew up in that church, and they continued to go there until the end. And when they had in church, it's Messiah Baptist Church of Bridgeport, when they had the welcoming visitors, I stood up and I just thanked everyone at that church for their prayers. Thank you for being there for us, and all of that. And I would say, without me thinking about it, my walk with the Lord played a tremendous role throughout both situations, both mom and dad, without me thinking, oh, let me go ahead and pray, let me talk to the pastor. It was just naturally woven throughout both of those crises, and not just both, but all the crises. Me losing my job, my breast cancer, my husband losing his job. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer within weeks of my mother's diagnosis, the first thing I did after calling mom was I called the pastor of the church and my women's prayer group, my women's Bible study group. So my walk with the Lord played a major role throughout.
Wow. Yeah, and it's just so interesting because you made me think about the communities that come together when you are dealing with grief and how they help. So for me, what was interesting when both of my parents passed, they both wanted to be done by the same funeral home. I was lucky enough that with my father who passed after my mom, because my dad was around, so we had all of that planning. When my father passed, I was like, crap, I don't have, so like a really close family member's father eulogized my father. And the funeral home and the cemetery it was I can joke about it because it's just close to home. But when my mom passed, and we had a lot of family members that went through that funeral home, then legit a year and a half later, because my mom passed March 2015, dad passes a little before Christmas 2017. I show back up to the funeral home, and the funeral director was like, "Why do you look so familiar?" And I was like, "I was just here a year and a half ago." And because of that, they gave us a discount. Like they were like, "You're here again." And then also too, like when my mom passed, my dad had a beautiful community of friends that came around. And then when his funeral came around, they literally did the same tribute at my dad's funeral that they did at my mom. So it was just so interesting the communities that were built for me that helped me through this process. And then now, because I grew up religious, but I don't have a church home, and I pray a lot now because I'm just like I got to connect to something greater now that
Hmm.
my roots are gone. And
Yeah.
so I'm so glad, Opal. I'm so glad that you posed that question because it made me think about um especially like a lot of the like religious rituals too, because I know for my parents the funeral and like like specific gospel songs and all of that were very important, and like certain rituals. So yeah, Opal, thanks for posing that question. Yeah. So and I just was extremely vulnerable to a lot of people. A lot of my close friends know the story, but not everyone on Black Writers Read. So we're about to wrap up shortly. I have a couple more questions.
Okay.
Um so I think this is really interesting because I'm glad that you mentioned to everyone here that you wrote practically a script for one of the sections in the book. So and that explains because I was like, yeah, journalist, I see it now. So you began your career as a broadcast journalist, which is so you could see it throughout the storytelling and the witnessing in this particular book. How did you transition to becoming an author? And what skills from your career in journalism have you carried with you in your writing career?
I had always wanted to write a novel since I was a child. I loved reading, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, Charlotte's Web. Black Beauty, all those stories. And that was my goal, was to eventually, I was thinking that, well, maybe when I retire, I'll start writing creatively. But I started much earlier. I'm still working. And I found that the journalism did help because I was a newspaper reporter early on in my early 20s, and having to work with editors and understanding how they can enhance your work. I mean, they can really polish your work for you, make it much better. Because some writers who have not had that experience don't want anyone to touch anything, don't change a word, but they can help you make it better. Deadlines, understanding the importance of meeting a deadline when you're writing. And if you have a deadline when you're writing a newspaper article, you have to make that, you make yourself make that deadline. And having to make sense, take something that's happened, some big thing, and encapsulate it and express it. So those were all skills I got when I worked in journalism, and they were all very helpful to me with this book and with the other book as well.
And I just thought of something, my short term memory. Um, when you mentioned the previous response about possibly becoming a deacon when you retire, I hope you do. And the reason why I say that is I grew up in a Baptist church as well in Detroit, but it was very like women did not lead at all. Like we had the mother's board and actually had some ushers, but other than that, I didn't see women lead. And I feel like my relationship with religion in the church would probably look a lot different if I had women leaders in the church when I grew up. And I remember I didn't experience my first woman leader in a church until we had a family friend pass away. Maybe like I was in my first grad degree in like the mid 2000s, and it was
Mhm.
a woman preacher for the church. It was an AME church, and I remember I walked up to her. I made a point to find her after the service. I like gave her a hug. I started crying, and I said, if I had more women spiritual leaders in my life, my path would probably look a lot more different now. So I do hope that that is something that you do when you retire, because you will make a difference in someone's life.
Well, thank you, thank you. I'm going to pray about that and see if that's where I'm led. And growing up at Messiah Baptist Church, all the deacons were male.
Mhm.
But in recent years, I was saying about maybe 20 years ago, things began to evolve, and they had deacons and deaconesses, and now I believe they call them all deacons. But they have female deacons now. It's refreshing to see that happening.
Nice. And then the last question I have for you today, Lisa, is what is next for you and how can the Black Writers Read community support you on this journey?
I have been working on another novel, a historical novel, for years now, and I had maybe a couple hundred pages worth of something. I wasn't sure where it was going. And then that's around the time that mom got sick. And I would go back and fiddle with the novel, and then dad had his issues. And then, they each passed away. So I'm thinking that, later this summer, I want to get back to that novel. And this novel is something that I learned that in Boston, on Beacon Hill, there was a black neighborhood in the 1800s, mid 1800s, and there were a number of enslaved Africans in the South who made their way up here to Boston, and there were people, abolitionists, who helped them out. Many of them were black. I would love to write something about that. That's what I'm working on, something about that. And just wish me luck that I can
Yes.
actually come out with something that has a beginning, middle, and end. That's an actual story. I have scenes, but not an
Yeah.
actual. I don't think anyone. I mean, the closest we have at this point is Dorothy West had written some things about in Boston. One she wrote about, it was on the vineyard, but there's another book that she wrote that took place in Boston, but it was the 1920s, I think. I want to go back further than that, in the 1800s, and we'll see if I can come up with something that I can get published. I'm hoping to do that.
Nice. And then also, I hope it's okay that I put a plug out here for this because I do have, given that I'm an educator, academics in my life and who watch. Prior to Lisa and I coming on, she mentioned wanting to get this book in the hands of university students and colleges. So, folks, my community is pretty wide. So, please book Lisa on your campuses. There's her website, lisabraxton.com. Also, feel free reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to put you in contact with Lisa, because it'll be awesome if more and more people across the country and across the globe get access to your book.
That would be great. I would love to see it as like I know when I was in college, we had the academic books we had to read, then the extra books that we had that were also suggested reading that were in the bookstore to pick up to supplement the reading. I would love to see this book as a supplemental reading.
Oh, well, one place that it will be, so now that you've officially been on Black Writers Read, so I started Black Writers Read bookshelves at a couple of the local colleges here in Connecticut and Western Mass that contain books written by the authors that are featured on here. There's a shelf at Connecticut State Community College, a Snuntuck campus in Enfield, Bard Holyoke, which is where I teach in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and Holyoke Community College. So your book will be on those three shelves, and I'm in the process of talking with other places to get books there as well for Black Writers Read authors.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Lisa, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, especially since you had the workshop this morning. And I just really, and also to reaching out to be on Black Writers Read. So, thank you so much.
And thank you. Thank you, Nicole.
Yeah, so I'm going to wrap up a couple of things and then you and I can touch base afterwards. So, thank you so much. And we'll chat like in a couple of seconds. So everyone, this is the end of the road. Episode 18 of season 4 Black Writers Read. This is the last episode of the season, at least the last live stream. Please be sure to subscribe to the audio podcast, because there are some things that I will be releasing over the summer that are exclusive to the audio podcast. Wherever you get your podcast, trust me, we are there. And when you subscribe to Black Writers Read on the audio podcast, drop a 5-star review. And one of the reasons why I say a review is it helps to grow my community. It helps for other people to find me. Subscribe, share, review, all of those great things. Thank you so much for a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful season 4. Thank you so much for helping to grow the platform in the way that you have. It's still hard to believe that it will be like 4 or 5 years coming up on Juneteenth in 2020. When we first started, it was first started as a 1-day event. Thank you for continuing to help Black Writers Read grow, but also Black readers and Black writers to grow. So thank you all for spending your afternoon with us. I can't believe we're about to end this season. And please be sure to continue that Black authors matter. Have a great summer, and please be sure to subscribe to the audio podcast. Thanks so much.